Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Genesis, a home for morality, freedom, and family. It is my pleasure to welcome my friend and prolific speaker, Lloyd De Jongh, to our group tonight. Lloyd is a valuable independent researcher for many years, and his insights have been invaluable to the pursuit of truth. We are privileged to have Lloyd with us tonight, and we look forward to hearing his thought-provoking lecture on the Pagan philosophical roots of materialism. So, Lloyd, thank you very much for all that you do, and the stage is all yours.
No, thank you. So, hello, everyone. Welcome. Please ask your questions as you go, and I will try to answer what I can. So please feel free to speak up and ask. If I can answer immediately, I will do so. Otherwise, we'll try and note them down and tackle them later. Otherwise, drop them in the chat, and we'll, if we can just monitor the chat and see if we can respond to you. All right. So today's talk is I'm going to have to share my screen. I have to figure that out again. Yeah, it's back to the same story. How do I do that now again? Screen sharing. And there we go. Screen 2. And my screen is shared. There we go. Yeah, so today's talk, we're going to be talking about materialism and atheism. And it should be noted that atheism and scientific materialism go together, but these are not a scientific ideology or a scientific philosophy. In fact, it's not even a philosophy. It is genuinely paganism. It is derived from Greek paganism going back 2,600 years. Now, if you've watched any of my series on Darwin, you will find that Darwin himself was repeating pagan ideas. These are not original. And in fact, there were scientists of the day who were stating that Darwin was utilizing Mohammedan evolution, or in other words, Muslim evolution, but he wasn't crediting the Muslims for the idea that he was promoting, which was evolution, which the Sufis were promoting as part of their concept of how the world was created. And of course, it's just their way of getting rid of God. So yeah, you guys can see my screen. So this is scientific paganism when 6th century BC philosophical squabbles became science. So we'll try and do half of this today and then half probably next week. So let's talk about humanism, secular humanism and atheism. So we're going back to 5th century BC paganism. So this is a paper called The Humanism of Charles Francis Potter and Roy Wood Sellers and Abner James Langley. Right, so this is talking about 3 important people in the humanist movement. And this was by Boston University Graduate School, a 1935 thesis. We will look at this paper again later. And it says here, the term humanism can be used to describe the intellectual movement of the 5th century BC in Greece. What this tells us is this is not a new idea. This is an old idea revived effectively during the Enlightenment because they wanted to find any kind of potential replacement for Christianity, specifically the Catholic Church. And not only that, they wanted to find any kind of intellectual system to replace that of scholasticism, which was the use of logic, of Aristotelian logic, propositional logic, and rigorous methodology to find truth. They wanted to create their own form of truth, their own intellectual system. They had to reject what came down from the Judeo-Christian Aristotelian tradition. So they had to replace the church and they had to replace logic. And of course, all the philosophy that came out of that is, in some way or another, the premise is flawed, and therefore the conclusions are flawed. The whole structure is deeply flawed. It says this was initiated by the sophists. The sophists are liars, and carried on by Socrates. The spirit of this movement is well expressed in that famous maxim given to posterity by Protagoras, that man is the measure of all things, that man's senses, the 5 senses, touch, taste, smell, hearing, and sight, are all that determines what is real, and that there is nothing real beyond that. In other words, there are no metaphysical concepts, like logic is a metaphysical concept. The number 1 is a metaphysical concept. And what is odd, though, we'll discuss, is that these people who are materialists, who claim that every single thing that exists is matter extending into space, they have to make use of metaphysical concepts which they deny, metaphysical concepts that they absolutely reject and deny. They have to use those to prove their points, because even proof is a metaphysical concept. Any thoughts before I go on?
I'm listening and learning. I'm looking forward to hear your criticizing about Thales and Heraclitus. I'm sure you will.
So the ancient Greeks were generally considered pagans. Now this, as you can see here, what period is this from, do you think, Harry? What period is this from here that we're looking at?
The image is not clear. I can hardly see it.
Sorry,
I think it's the French Revolution.
It is the French Revolution, exactly. This is the Enlightenment. This is the Age of Reason. Yeah, so these images are from...
Can you make the images a little more clear? They're like faded.
I know, that's what I do in the background because I have to put text over them like that. So if I don't fade them, then they overwhelm the text. So let me just do this. Yeah, I can't do. I'll have to do time. Let me show you one of these.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Okay now?
Sure.
I'm kind of new to the group and everything. I apologize in advance. What's your own stance about everything? I mean, religion and all that. Just to understand what's.
I'm an agnostic, dyslexic, insomniac, so I lie awake all night wondering if there really is a dog.
Yeah, let's continue. Okay, yeah, so it's the French Revolution, and it's the Statue of Reason, I suppose, that in the Notre Dame church, right?
Yeah, so this is so let me just go back there and just to change that. Yeah, sorry about the flippant answer. I'm Christian, so I grew up Christian, and so my worldview would be shaped by that. Ancient Greeks were generally considered pagans. Now, in the French Enlightenment, of course, all these philosophers, what they did was they were looking for a replacement philosophy. They were looking for some source that they could use as a substitute, and they all turned to occultism. I've covered that in other episodes. If you look at my series on atheism called The Cult of Reason, I go in depth on that. And remember, I always provide my sources. My sources are available for everyone to check. And they started to utilize these philosophies of these Greek pagans. As you can see here, the pagan symbolism, right? The pagan goddesses were very, very important to them. So paganism is a very broad term to describe non-Abrahamic religions, particularly those that were prevalent before the rise of Christianity. So it was a term that was commonly used by Christians. The ancient Greeks practiced a polytheistic religion. They worshipped gods and goddesses like Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and Aphrodite. If you read some of the later church fathers, like the 8th century church fathers, they speak of the Muslims worshipping Aphrodite, for instance. They had elaborate rituals, temples, and festivals dedicated to their deities, which formed a significant part of their cultural and religious practices. Right? Aristotle, Plato, Socrates were influenced by all of these cultural and religious climates, right? Well, of their time, but they made contributions in thought and philosophy that went beyond the traditional pagan framework. Right? Paganism is a very specific set of ideas, right? As distinct from Judaism, as distinct from Christianity. Of course, lots of people want to make the claim that Christianity is pagan, but these are two distinct sets of ideas. And in fact, the pagans were complaining that the Christians were starting to cause people to leave paganism and convert to Christianity. So, the Enlightenment is often deemed scientific and modern, right? Especially as in the French Revolution, but this was actually a celebration of pagan culture. There's a book by Peter Gay called The Rise of the New Paganism, which was his study and history of the atheist movement in the French Enlightenment, in the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And he called it The Rise of the New Paganism because it's quite distinct that this is the rebirth of paganism. So modern science is supposed to be modern science, but let's see if it has a very pagan overtone. That's what we're going to look at today. So we've got this quote: "How is it that hardly any major religion has looked at science and concluded, this is better than we thought? The universe is much bigger than our prophets said, grander, more subtle, and more elegant." For those of you who know the Torah, I mean, does the Bible say that the world is small, tiny, and irrelevant? Or does it say that God made something grand and great? What are your thoughts?
My friends will...
Sorry?
I would go with grand and great.
Yeah, he made a grand, great world, right? Yeah. Instead, they say, no, my God is a little God, and I want him to stay that way. That's on page of Torah, right? Right, Harry? It's on page 5, The Jews say God is a little God and I want him to stay small, right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, exactly. It's a religion, old or new, that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. And that's why the Christians in Europe built those massive towering churches and steeples because yeah, whatever. Sooner or later, such a religion will emerge. That's told by Carl Sagan in his book Pale Blue Dot, A Vision of the Human Future in Space. So one day we'll have a scientific religion that really appreciates the universe. And we're going to see if this guy's... Now, Carl Sagan is talking out of his ass here, obviously. But also, Carl Sagan, for all intents and purposes, was an atheist, even though he claimed to be an agnostic. Let's put it that way. All right. So universities all began as religious institutions. Now you can trace places of learning like the yeshivas. You've got the academies in Greece. And of course, I've spoken to some rabbis that strongly feel that the Greek academies were influenced by the Jewish yeshivas. That's actually where the idea came from. So C.S. Lewis said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a law giver. So the idea of scientific laws actually derives from the Bible because God is consistent, God is coherent, and God is a lawgiver, and he gave us natural law, that the universe runs based on the character, the nature, and the consistency of God. So there must be some sort of law that runs the universe, something that governs it, in other words, from that concept. So the idea of scientific laws is not an atheist invention, it is a religious invention. And especially it comes out of the Middle Ages from the Christian monasteries, where this idea really took root. Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw the other into a wider world, a world in which both can flourish, and that's Pope John Paul II. So that's extremely pagan, don't you think, Harry? That definitely sounds a little pagan to me. Well, what about you?
Unfortunately, my dogs just barked, so I didn't hear your last sentence. Forgive me. I will have to read.
Okay. No, I was just saying that this sounds kind of pagan. I'm being sarcastic. I mean, this is obviously science can purify religion from error and superstition, and religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. And he's right. And that's Pope John Paul. And then we've got this last quote from Thomas Henry Huxley, who talked out of both sides of his mouth nonstop. True science and true religion are twin sisters, and the separation of either from the other is sure to prove the death of both. Science prospers exactly in proportion as it is religious, and religion flourishes in exact proportion to the scientific depth and firmness of its basis. That is Thomas Henry Huxley. Now, this is quoted from a lecture by Huxley in a book called What Knowledge is of Most Worth. Or from a lecture, and the lecture, it's in a book called Lectures in Education by Herbert Spencer from the Royal Institution of 1855, and so on and so on. Right, now, whether he actually said this, obviously that we have to trust the source on this, but Thomas Henry Huxley in other sources absolutely positively hates the church, hates God, hates the Bible, and does nothing but smear them. Huxley also extinguished theologians lie about the cradle of every science as the strangled snakes besides that of Hercules. So in other words, science has killed religion. Science has killed the priest, made them unnecessary. Science needs to kill religion. So this man is contradicting himself already. And Pope Pius XII, in his encyclical Humani Generis, acknowledged the importance of taking positive sciences into account, particularly when dealing with proved facts. Okay, so now I'm just going to go to Wikipedia. Okay, I'm going to bring up this list now. So there are lots of people that make the claim. Now, if you look at the Nobel Prize, there's so many people who've won the Nobel Prize that are religious, right? From Jews to Christians. This is a Wikipedia list, a Wakipedia list of lay Catholic scientists. And it's so long that that's index here from A to Z. And I'll just go through this very quickly. But you can see here, these are all Christians. Now, of course, atheists, materialists like to say, well, if you're religious, of course, then you've given up your brain and you've lost all access to reason. But, it looks like science came from people who hold religion in high esteem, right? And there are loads of famous names on this list, right? So these are all Christians, these are all religious people, these are Catholics specifically, who, all of them, even Galileo Galilei, were very much involved in science. So yeah, so the whole atheist claim is just that. It's an empty claim. It's meaningless. All right. Now, within the first 50 years of the printing press being invented, right, 20 million books were produced, which is interesting. You'd think that those weren't just 20 million Bible. That was 20 million books, right? So in other words, the first published Bible, right? So the first printed Bible was in 1455, right? And this was the genesis of science, because now suddenly these ideas could be made permanent and spread, right? So the printing press enabled, of course, the development of this, but it also meant that suddenly ideas could spread. And not just the Bible. This wasn't something that was strictly just restricted to the church, right? Now, atheism, sophism, and materialism. So the sophists believed that all thinking is dependent on just the senses and personal impressions. In other words, all thinking is subjective. And this led to the absence of any objective criteria for personal behavior except for societal norms. How they get those societal norms, that's one of those mysteries. Now, specializing in rhetoric, the sophists were more professional educators than philosophers. So I'll be coming back to these points, and I'll be covering more and more of these as we go. So they flourished as a result of the for Greek education at the time, right? So there were prominent sophists called, like Protagoras, lived in 490 BC. From Abdera in Thrace, there was Gorgias, 487 BC. From Leontini in Sicily, and Hippias, 485. So looking at this period, this 5th century BC, from Elis in the Peloponnesos, and Prodicus from the island of Chaos. Now, Gorgias, Hippias, Prodicus, and Protagoras are all 5th century. They cultivated the art of defending or attacking a thesis by means of argument. In other words, their whole point was not to find truth. Their whole point was to undermine an argument and to win. So this was the art of never being wrong. It is the art of winning. When you hear politicians talk, they utilize this method of speaking, of never answering a question directly. You cannot get them to answer yes or no to yes or no questions. So this concern for the techniques of argument led to verbal displays of debating skills, what Plato called eristic. Now, eristic is an interesting, it's worth looking up, but it's really about being argumentative. So it's commonly called disputation, but it's someone who is heuristic is someone who is argumentative. They are nitpickers. They will all constant. You've all dated that girl, guys. You all know who she is, right? Now, in Islam, this idea is called adab al-jadal and hiyal. These are methods of sophist rhetoric, methods of debate. In Islam, they've perfected this, methods of lying while seemingly telling the truth, right? So in Islam, this is adab al-jadal. In mysticism, the norms of conduct which govern relations between master and disciples, and those between the disciples themselves. So it's got an application to Islamic mysticism, which is Islamic magic. So now we're talking about Sufism. And in military science, the plural form of adab is a synonym of hiyal, stratagems in war. Now, hiyal is an Islamic method of lying. They call it legal trickery. It is the way to apply the law and breaking the law while seemingly still following the law. So it's a method of deceit. It's defined, and I've got various videos on it. Look for hiyal on my channel. You'll find me discussing the Islamic methods of lying, and I go through several methods and I discuss them. Especially hiyal is the main source of that, of the method of lying. But notice it is a military strategy. In other words, it is military propaganda, ideological warfare. So methods of using words to deceive. And it's considered, like I said, a military science. Adab al-jadal, in theology and law, a method of debating in which discussed were questions that were controversial. So they call these people controversialists, but they're disputationists. Now, in the 9th century, what the caliph did was he hired a whole bunch of people. They trained them in this form of disputation, and they trained them to write propaganda to defeat counterpropaganda, right? Or to defeat the truth that was being spoken about them. So they created an entire government infrastructure. So this became part and parcel of Islamic methodology, Islamic thinking. Their practice is simply this counter-propaganda method. So notice it says it is not a matter of finding the truth, but of convincing the opponent. Notice you are seen as an opponent. You are the enemy, and they must convince you. So it is not truth. It is how do I persuade. It is the art of persuasion by utilizing rhetoric, sophistry, and lies. Your thoughts, Harry, before I go on.
I meet that every day, all day long, in the group, outside of the group, and many times I have to introspect my own descriptions and arguments to make sure that I'm not using sophistry. So I absolutely agree with everything you said.
Yeah. Now, oddly enough, when you compare the methods of Hiyal, this method of sophistry, the Protestants developed a very similar method. They called it Protestant scholasticism. They named it after the Catholic form invented by Thomas Aquinas of scholasticism, which is a method of finding the truth based on Aristotelian logic, propositional logic, and such. However, the Protestants used it as a method of arguing against the evidence to convince the other one of truth, to undermine those arguments, undermine the opponent, and to weaken his arguments by utilizing specious arguments that sounded plausible. So this was something the Protestants used, but also it is used to redefine terms. And we know the left will always redefine terms. So they never mean the words in the same way. They've got the same vocabulary. They've got a completely different dictionary. Hiyal, singular, hila, artifices, devices, expedients, stratagems, the means of evading a thing. In other words, evading the truth, a way of evading the truth, affecting an object. Artifices. Artifice is a way to cheat. Tricks of beggars and conjurers. So it's magic. It's the use of verbal magic, word magic. In law, it is the circumvention of the law. In other words, how to break the law. Legal devices, the use of legal means for extra legal ends. In other words, how to break the law. Extra legal means illegal. So this is part and parcel of Islamic culture. And in military science, maqa'id and adab is a technical term for stratagems of war. So this is how to lie to win an ideological battle. And yeah, this is something that the Muslims inherited from the Sophists. In fact, the Sufis, they often make these little jokes. They'll call themselves, the Sufis, right? They will often call themselves the Sophists, which is a play on the term sophists. So you'll see the Sufis play little word games like that. They'll joke. It's like little inside jokes in their comments if you read through some of their materials. So they are actually sophists. Sorry?
Sophisticated or sophists? What's sophists?
A sophist is someone who has trained in making what seem to be sophisticated arguments that are actually false, actually dishonest arguments that seem on the surface to be, but are actually just pretending to be. That they are very, very clever, subtle ways of lying.
Cool.
Yeah,
the word sophisticated does derive from it, yeah? Sorry.
Yeah, you just explained it earlier. Please wait with your question until the end. Please go on.
Yeah, let me just see if I have any, because sometimes I've got things in the, okay, I don't have anything in there. Let's double check. No, I don't. Okay, so let's close that. Now, sophists were instrumental in bringing argumentation to the central position that it held in Greek thought. So this was arguing. So they became very skilled at debate. The whole point was having a debate and then beating the other guy. The sophists were among the first people anywhere to demand that moral claims be justified by reasons. In other words, you had to provide an intellectual reason why something had to be regarded as moral. And in other words, if they could argue better than you, they could simply get rid of morality by means of a smarter intellectual argument. Like we know that baby is useless. It's 2 years old. What's he doing? It's just taking up space, taking up time, taking up food. What the heck? Throw him out the door, feed him to the lions. We don't need the kid, so abort him at 2 years old. That's exactly the kind of thing that they did. And we hear that today. So, sophists and sophistry. Now let's talk about Protagoras. In the Merriam-Webster, for instance, sophistry says subtly deceptive reasoning or argumentation. So it is deceptive reasoning, deceptive argumentation, but it's very subtle. It's often hard to detect. The first known use of the word sophistry is in the 14th century. Now, sophists are Greek teachers of rhetoric and philosophy prominent in the 5th century. They were considered clever in their reasoning, but later philosophers, especially Plato, described them as sham philosophers. They were out for money. They were willing to say anything to win an argument. Sophists, from Greek sophes, a wise man or an expert, it's really meant as an insult at the end of the day. It earned a negative connotation as a captious or fallacious reasoner. Captious is someone who's just argumentative, grumpy, always arguing about stuff. Fallacious is obviously false. Sophistry is reasoning that looks plausible on a superficial level, but is unsound or designed to deceive. Now, rhetoric in sophistry is the practice of persuasive communication. This is aimed at manipulating and influencing audiences through the skilled use of language and argumentation. It prioritizes style and emotional appeal over truth and over reason. This is what you would call propaganda. Others would just call it lying. Any comments before I go on? Hopefully that should answer the question.
Everything is very clear. I just want to add, earlier you spoke about what was prior to universities, and you spoke about the yeshivas. Also the monasteries, the Christian monasteries, were prior to the secular universities.
Yeah, I actually cover that in this one series I have. I've got about 6 episodes on theological. It's called Theological, because it discusses how religion is actually based on logic. It's based on reason, because that's why we have the term theology, but theological, because you cannot divorce religious ideas from logic. The two, because if his nature is honest, if his nature is if he's the logos, right? If his nature is coherent, then what God creates must also follow that rule. If God's mind is coherent, the mind of God is coherent, then the creation of God must also be coherent. So therefore you have this idea of theological, and I discuss Aristotle, Aquinas, and I discuss universities in this talk. So I discuss this, but this is on my channel. You can have a look at that. So yeah, universities, we talk about universities as well. I discuss their founding and their purpose back in the day. So heuristic is all about engaging in argumentation for the purpose of winning, not to find truth, not as an intellectual pursuit, purely to win. And this is where you get propaganda from. This is where you get Hamas is fantastically good. And I mean, you have to admit, their propaganda is fantastically good. Right? The art of winning, never being wrong. So it uses deceptive or fallacious tactics to undermine arguments rather than engaging in genuine dialogue, and you're not looking to get a resolution. So it's a form of intellectual dishonesty, prioritizes winning and personal gain over knowledge or truth. So it's characterized often by ad hominem attacks, right? Attacking the man, undermining the man, logical fallacies, and manipulation techniques rather than substantive evidence or thoughtful reasoning. Captious is the tendency or character trait to find fault or to raise objections over trivial things, to nitpick. I mean, you've all dated someone like that, right? I mean, as a guy, I think everyone I know has dated that girl and left her, right? So it often involves an overly critical or nitpicking attitude where someone is looking for reasons to criticize, dispute, even when it's not necessary. Captious people find flaws, they find weaknesses in your arguments, in your statements, your actions, in a very argumentative manner. They don't appreciate what was good, but they look for tiny things that they can attack and mark as bad. This is also someone who's meticulous or pedantic, and they focus on minor details, minor discrepancies, and they'll undermine you on that basis. They'll ignore all the positives. Those are captious people. So let's look at Gorgias. He's a nihilist, right? And Gorgias was famous for saying, nothing exists. And even if something exists, nothing can be known about it. And even if something can be known about it, knowledge about it cannot be communicated to others. So this just tells me this guy's full of poop, but yeah. So his perspective reflects a very skeptical and relativistic view. In other words, but also he's not going to give you an inch. He's not going to acknowledge evidence. He's going to say, well, no, and blah, blah, blah. And then if you prove him wrong, he's going to say, well, but, and he's going to, and he's just going to keep going. He's going to move those goalposts. Notice he's shifting the goalposts here. This is sophistry. This is not even philosophy. This is what you call a mistake. It is purely just an error. So this is a very skeptical and highly relativistic view, suggesting that our understanding of reality is limited and that objective truth is inaccessible. But there's lots of critiques to be made. it is incoherent. His stance is self-defeating and logically inconsistent. By claiming that nothing exists and that knowledge and communication are impossible, he's undermining his own arguments, as the act of making these assertions implies the existence of something, that he's got knowledge of it, and that he's trying to communicate them. Understand, they utilize concepts that they reject. They refer immediately to concepts that they deny, and this is completely stupid. But we're going to see that this guy is actually fundamental to the thinking of these idiot materialists. Relativism. His skepticism and emphasis on the limitations of knowledge is an extreme form of relativism, and it's extremely nihilistic. It is totally nihilistic, and all perspectives become equally valid or invalid. In fact, it's all entirely subjective, so this is completely subjective. It's purely whatever is valid is what's in your mind. And this undermines the possibility of rational discourse and objective understanding. So it is directly a rejection of rationality. It's a direct attack on reality. It's a denial of reality. And it's for whatever reasons, this is purely an attack on reason and the real. Any thoughts before I go on, Harry?
I think we can categorize all those people under the rationalist movement in philosophy.
Yes, and we'll get to those. Yeah, exactly. We're doing more talks on these. I've got lots of notes on this because I'll be going through these movements. I'll be doing the Enlightenment in the near future because, man, if you start taking apart their philosophies, you look at their founding premises, it's just trash. It's absolute trash from Descartes, Hume, Kant. It's like, you're like, how fucking stupid are these people? You just have to like think. Like, they say all these wonderful things, but you look at the fundamental basis of their thinking, you're like, that is incoherent trash. So yeah,
and look how they mock the idea of reason, and basically they detach it completely from the senses and the empiric experience of that which exists.
Yeah, no, we're going to go through that. So yeah, you're going to see this is a complete joke. So practical implications. His philosophy has negative consequences. So by denying the existence of anything and dismissing the value of knowledge. Now notice this though. People who say these things are very confident of their message. They are absolutely convinced. Okay? Nothing exists. All right? Nothing is real. Right? Everything is relative. And you're like, so is that an absolute statement you made or a relative statement? And for sure, it's an absolute statement, which is incoherent because if everything is relative, how can they be making absolute statements? Understand? It's coherent. It's incoherent on the face of it, right? So this leads to apathy, indifference, and a lack of engagement with the world. So in other words, it's kind of Gnostic. You're rejecting the world and you are purely adopting the narcissism of the self, of your own thoughts, your own subjectivity. This discourages efforts to seek truth, to pursue knowledge, and communicate effectively with others. And it corrupts science, it corrupts thought, and it destroys society at the end of the day. It destroys morality, in fact, utterly destroys morality. Denial of empirical evidence, which you hinted at earlier. Gorgias challenges the notion of empirical evidence as a valid basis for knowledge and understanding. You see, that's why we have Oprah's my truth. I have my truth. You have your truth. 1 + 1 = 5 for me because that's my truth. No, these are external things that exist. But of course, they reject Aristotle's metaphysics. Empirical observation and evidence play a critical role in our understanding of reality. So by his dismissal, his philosophy is unrealistic and completely disconnected from the world. All that is real is what is in his mind. This is a massive, massive, shall we say, dose of pride, of utter narcissism that only you are real, only what you think, only what goes through your mind is valid. That is pride taken to an extreme. That is narcissism taken to an extreme. And this is a very interesting philosopher. This guy does some really great talks. He's dead now, but German guy, Hans-Georg Gadamer. And he says nothing exists except through language. And that is really profound because if God is logos. Yes,
did he exist when he said that?
Who's that? Gorgias?
Yeah, no, this Hans-Georg Gadamer.
No, you've got to read what he says. You've got to understand what he says. Because think about this. If you don't have words, right, concepts don't exist if you can't describe them. They become vague or fuzzy or non-existent because you can't categorize them. You can't describe them. You cannot make distinctions because you don't have the words for them. So you must have words to describe something or it doesn't exist. You don't see it. It just becomes this big mush, right? But the moment you have vocabulary, you can start to distinguish between things. And therefore, it begins to exist and it takes on form. And as you study it, you develop vocabulary to describe it. And then it becomes more real.
So the particulars which have qualities and specific characteristics do not exist. Only when you abstract them and you find some kind of universals to find the common ground between all particulars, then they began to exist.
You must, no, it does not. He's not saying they don't exist. He's saying, look, in your mind, you don't perceive them because the word is how you capture them. If you don't have the words, you can't capture them. You've got nothing objective to pin them to. You don't have a label to apply to it. So it doesn't exist. It's just stuff out there, just stuff, understand? So there, you must have language because God is logos. God is the word, and the word is required, and the word must be true. That's why God is truth. God is logos. Therefore, you must have the word to attach to things, to describe things with. But if you don't have the word, then everything you describe is going to be false. So he says here, okay, he said language plays a crucial role in our understanding and our experience of reality. His statement that nothing exists except through language can be understood in the context of hermeneutic philosophy. This focuses on the interpretation of texts and the understanding of meaning. Ask yourself why the left, why Muslims, why propagandists are always corrupting the meaning of words, changing meanings, always redefining words. So he emphasized the significant influence of language on our perception and interpretation of the world. Look, if I go to where I grew up, right, and I start speaking like that, I mean, it's completely different personality that emerges when you start speaking like someone who's highly uneducated. It's like, yo, man, that thing is most lekker. I mean, it's like, it's like, that thing is most just so lekker, man, just like, yeah. Think about that. Was that coherent? No, because this person has no vocabulary to describe something. So his experience of it is utterly different to yours when you can contextualize it in detail and compare it to other things in detail. This person has a very broad, very vague, extremely uneducated, rough view of things. So his concept of the world, his ability to describe the world, to experience the world, is extremely limited, right? It's extremely uneducated. So language is a tool for communication, but it also shapes our understanding. How do you describe something to yourself if you have a very poor understanding of grammar, of logic, of vocabulary? So according to Gadamer, language is not a neutral medium. So think about this. Where does language come from, right? Atheists love to try and explain where language came from, but they can't. It can't arise. It has to arise from something metaphysical, right? And we have language so that we can express and think. So, but an active force, language is an active force that not only conveys meaning, but it shapes and constitutes our experience and our knowledge. So the better that I understand language, the better I can experience the world, and the better I can describe that world, and the better that I can manipulate that world. If I have terrible language, terrible grammar, then this starts to limit me. And this is why education is so critical. That's why when you see blacks who've got very bad language in education, you can tell how they become, in a sense, this crudeness within. Does that make sense?
Yes. I think I'm confused. What is your personal understanding of this Gadamer? Are you supporting what he said, or you're?
No, he's not. I mean, because our understanding of the world is always mediated through language, because we don't mediate things through pantomime, right? We use language to describe the world, right?
Yeah, but even if we are not using language to communicate with each other, we are still limited and supported by, the existence, the reality itself. And
in our brains, we're talking to ourselves, right? We have an inner voice. We are thinking things through in language. And if we want to communicate the world, we have to communicate what we see through language, right?
Okay,
through words.
So we have to articulate things better in order for us to be more exact in relation to that which exists, the entity itself. But the entity doesn't change if we add...
No, he's not saying that the world doesn't exist if you don't have words. He's saying that effectively look, if you take some guy out of the bush, right? He doesn't have the words to describe things. So when he sees something, he literally, physiologically doesn't even perceive it because he's got no concept of it. The words for it don't exist, and therefore that thing doesn't exist. They simply don't see the truth because they don't have the words for it, right? They don't have the concepts for it. They don't have the way to describe it. Then as far as they're concerned, that thing isn't there. Perceptually, it's just not there.
Could you say it's
yeah.
comprehension? Comprehension.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, good term. So language frames our thoughts, it frames our concepts, our interpretations, and it allows us to make sense of the world. So without language, nothing can be understood and nothing can be known. He's not saying there is no world outside, that because I have words now suddenly, look, I'm a magician, I've created the world. He's saying, no, you can't understand that without having a medium that allows you to manipulate it, to understand it, to frame it in your own mind and translate it across to others. So he doesn't say that reality itself is reducible to language. He says our access to reality and our ability to interpret and understand reality are intertwined with language. Language is the medium through which we construct and communicate meaning. And this allows us to engage with the world, share experiences, because language is critical as the medium for interacting with the world. Yeah?
No, I don't want to, emphasize anything. Let's continue.
No, I think you misunderstood. I think you misunderstood from the beginning that he said the world doesn't exist. No, he's saying, this is what he's saying. We need the world outside. Without language, we don't understand the world. You have to have language.
People lived, hunters and gatherers lived in communities even prior to language. It was a very basic language, and yet they understood their environment and they were able to recognize.
Yeah, they built skyscrapers. They went to Mars. They built pyramids.
No, of course they didn't. But still, in their limited,
because development, social development, is also is dependent on language. The better your ability to express language can express things like philosophy, mathematics, science. So as you start to develop a more sophisticated language, you develop a more sophisticated understanding. If all you see is me hungry, me kill, me eat, then your life is very limited. You don't see things beyond those basic boundaries that you've set within the language. But once you start to, the language encompasses other things. Those things, now suddenly you bring them into focus. And you can start to manipulate those concepts because now you're developing language for them and you start to see them better. So pre-Socratic philosophers, Aristotle, yeah? Sorry?
No, I just wanted to add that once you start distorting the language, you are actually distorting reality.
Yes. Actually, that is a very critical point. Yes, because reality needs to. Yeah. Yes. Actually, hold on. That's a very valid point. There's a quote that actually is worth bringing in here. Is that I'll be brief. No. Here's a quote. That's actually a very valid point. And let me just put this quote here. A language is well ordered when its words express reality with as little distortion and as little omission as possible. So that's a book by Joseph Pieper called Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power, which is really interesting. So this guy writes really well. So this is what George Gadamer is saying as well, right? These two concepts are parallel. So when your language is disordered, your sense of reality is disordered. You start to distort reality. But if you want to find truth, you must have language to describe reality with precision. Otherwise, you are out of touch with reality. Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah. So that's all he's getting at there. So there were pre-Socratic philosophers, right? These were ancient Greek thinkers who lived before Socrates, like Thales, Anaximander, and Heraclitus. Heraclitus was the biggest idiot after Gorgias. Now, these thinkers rejected traditional mythological explanations, and they searched for rational, what they claimed, quote-unquote, rational explanations based on observable phenomena. Now, this doesn't mean that they were rational in the sense of we're looking for evidence. No, it means that what their brain subjectively decided was evidence, that's what they glommed onto. They asked questions about the origins of existence, the variety in nature, and the mathematical description of nature, and came to all the wrong conclusions. So they sought universal principles to explain nature as a whole and identified problems and paradoxes that became influential in later studies of maths, science, philosophy. So Aristotle is a student of Plato, lives during the 4th century BC, long after the pre-Socratic era. Aristotle is one of the most influential philosophers in Western history. So he makes lots of contributions to physics, biology, logic, ethics, and politics. Aristotle expands on the concept of universals. and he makes significant contributions to metaphysics. So he believes that universals, such as the essence or form of something, exist in particular objects and are not separate entities in themselves. So, in short, basically, so when you look at a dog, you know it's a dog, whether it's a Great Dane or a Chihuahua, it's got a dogness to it. That is the universal, right? You've got the particular, which is the Chihuahua. That's one expression of dogness, right? But you know it's a dog. It's got that, or an apple. You know it's an apple. It's a different color apple. It's a different type of apple, but you know it's an apple. There's something apple-y about it. So there's an appleness to it. So those are the universals. Whereas these guys didn't believe in universals. They believed only in particulars. Like we look at women and we say, there's a womanness about them, a femininity, a thing that's universal male, universal female. Whereas, of course, now in the transgender movement, you've got this nominalism and you've got, no, I'm a woman. If I have these characteristics, I put in a wig, she had long hair, look, I'm wearing panties, I'm a woman now. I've got lipstick on, I'm a woman now, because they believe that the characteristics of particulars, right, are what define your existence in that group. So these superficial, literally superficial attributes are what create your belonging to a given group. That's how we categorize things, as opposed to believing that women have something inherently feminine about them that is universal. Aristotle's theory of hylomorphism, which considers the combination of matter and form in the existence of objects, is this big advancement in understanding the nature of reality. So he's looking at the essence, and the essence create the form, right? And form functions, right? And there's form and function. So he looks at the reality. We start to understand the nature of reality differently because of him, and we start to learn the relationship between universals and particulars. We'll talk more about that as we go. So, Socrates. There's two periods in philosophy, before and after Socrates. Socrates has significant impact on Western thought. So he dedicates his life to examining the concept of virtue. But of course, those philosophers who are rationalists, who are nominalists and so on, they actually deny the existence of objective morality. And therefore, they basically undermine this concept of virtue. Virtue does not exist. So if you look at Darwin in terms of his virtue, his morality, and there's my Darwin series for that, it's whatever helps you survive is good. Anything that gets in your way is bad. And thus you get the law of the jungle. And that deviates completely from what we would call biblical morality. So all philosophy is a footnote to Plato, as attributed to philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. So then we get the emergence of the sophists. They teach rhetoric, they teach oratory, which is good speaking skills, and logical argument, for a given value of logic, in exchange for payment. So the negative phrase mere sophistry is used to describe arguments that lack substance, because these guys would argue very well, but in a very specious manner. So Socrates engages in debates with the sophists. He criticizes their practices. Now, he was a sophist. He could be considered a sophist. He understood the methodology that they used, but he didn't charge for his teaching. Sophists worked for money, and they were more focused. And Socrates was focused on finding genuine knowledge and virtue, rather than solely teaching logical argumentation. So he's known for his wit, he's known for his irony, his eloquence, and he's a very insightful philosopher. He delves very deeply into his subjects, and according to the Greeks' belief in the Delphic oracle, who spoke on behalf of the gods, Socrates was declared the wisest man alive. And he employs what's called the Socratic method, which involved questioning his conversation partners until he discovered logical inconsistencies or paradoxes that disproved their arguments. And that's why, from a sophist point of view, you always try not to answer these questions. That's why you never give straight answers. You never give yes or no answers, because that means that you could be trapped in a corner and then you'd lose the argument. Okay, now before we go on further, let's talk briefly about Plato. And this is a very interesting article that I've read. In legitimizing state socialism, Plato plays an inglorious role. Plato's Politeia, also called Plato's Republic, right, is aristocratic. And this aristocratic republic is led by the philosophers who are recruited from the warrior caste, right? Now, the term philosophers in the context of Plato's works can also be translated as righteous or saints. So now you go back to the Enlightenment era, when you've got these philosophers, right, the philosophers, as they call themselves. They were effectively creating a new religion, a scientific religion they were the new righteous ones. They were the new prophets. They were the new saints. This is the part they didn't tell you at university, but these philosophers are replacing Christianity, replacing biblical philosophy, etc., biblical morality, with their particular new scientific pagan philosophy. So Plato designs an ideal state whose main purpose is the perfection of man, just like Hitler developed the Übermensch, and of course he had the perfect socialist man. So Plato has the opinion that the state can only fulfill its pastoral task within the framework of a state socialist form of organization. And when you start reading Plato, you start to realize he goes down a deep, dark rabbit hole. This man was one of the fundamental underlying causes of communism. Any thoughts before I go on?
Yeah, I think we can say that Plato is the source of the totalitarian way of thinking. He established that with his system of the philosopher king, who has this mystic knowledge, and he is supposed basically to take care of the entire body that consists of the mob, the warriors, and the other philosopher kings. And they know best because they are being led by their reason. And of course, their reason is connected with their external world of ideals, which only them have access to that. It's Gnostic.
It's Gnostic, exactly. So understand, this Gnosticism has always been evil, has always been totalitarian, has always been, in fact, just satanic. So let's continue. So this method, right, considered the foundation of Socrates' philosophy, is believed to have originated from a man called Zeno, a student of Parmenides. Yep.
Lloyd, if I may stop you for a second, just to make a point about the issue of the family. Plato, one of his ideas was that the philosopher's king, in order for them not to be attached to anything, they don't need to have their own wives or children. Their wives will be shared by others, and their children are going to be taken and raised by caregivers and not the parents themselves. So this is an example for the destruction of the family already then.
Actually, hold on. You know what? You're making me think of something. I need to find a reference. Let me see if I can find this reference. You guys are going to find this very worthwhile, I think. If I can find it. And okay, yeah, this is going to be interesting. So let me play this, okay? How far back does woke go? Well, let's have a look. The Congress women, okay? So let's look at the origins of woke. The women of the city, wearing beards and dressed in men's clothing, came to the assembly, and by a majority vote, they passed a resolution transferring all power in the state to women. They used this power to introduce a series of measures which are expounded in a dialogue, okay? Between, hold on, let me just actually just color everything in black here. Make actually, no, hold on. Let me just fill this in because
Lloyd, I would like to add that his philosophy was that the entire police state is basically one body, and everyone has to serve the body. And if, for example, you don't do what you need to do as part of that body, you should be removed, because it's not about your individual rights or existence or anything. You just serve the entire body. So, for example, those people who belong to the mob, if the philosopher king will tell them to do a certain thing and they object, it's like, it's like the foot doesn't do what the foot needs to do, so the foot will be removed.
So that's like the Sharia. Understand? That's like communism, but it's also the Sharia. That's where the Muslims got the idea. That idea, because it only works. The Republic, Plato's Politeia, only works if you control a large enough place. If you're at a tiny village of 10 people, it doesn't matter. You're not affecting the world. But if you control a state, if you control a continent, then you are starting to make an impact on the world because you control a large volume, a large body of people. Now you can introduce perfection. Right, you can micromanage everyone's behavior for perfection, and this is the Sharia. That's where the Muslims got it.
It's a beehive.
From studying Plato. Yeah. So the women pass a resolution transferring all the power in the state to the women. They use this power to introduce measures which are expounded in a dialogue between Praxagora, the leader of the women, and her husband Blepros. So they speak of compulsory universal community property is what I propose, across the board economic economic equality, to fill those fissures that scar our society's face. We need to get rid of inequality. No more the division between rich and poor. We're all going to be equal. We're not going to have rich and poor. We're going to be, all of us, equally wealthy. We'll wear the same clothes. We'll share the same food. My initial move will be to communalize the land, the money, and all other property. We'll take, and what about the landless man who's invisibly wealthy? What about the man with land? He hides his silver and gold in his pockets. What about him? Oh, he will put all the money in the government fund. It'll all go to the state. I will knock out the walls. I will remodel the city. I'll have no walls, no borders, thank you. No city walls, no keeping people out. We want one big happy household where all can come and go as they choose. I will pool the women. I will create a public hoard for the use of every man who wishes to take them to bed and make babies. A system like, yeah, does this start to make sense? Does that sound a little bit like what you said?
Wow, yeah.
Does this sound woke to you? Does this sound like the 21st century, 2023?
It does, but I suppose you're quoting someone very old, right?
Yes. So, and then they say, well, who's going to work the land and produce the food? Well, the slaves. This leaves you just one civic function. When the shades of night draw on, slip sleekly down to dinner. The state is not going to stint. The state's hand is full and open. It has large coffers and a large heart. It's going to stuff its menfolk free of charge, then issue them with torches when dinner's done and send them out to hunt for fun. This aligns very much with the statements of Marx. Marx obviously drew upon this. This is Aristophanes, the Ecclesiasuse, or the Congresswomen. And this comes from, I think this is 400 BC. 397 BC. This woke is actually, yeah, sorry?
No, it's shocking. I didn't realize that it's going back so long to that degree of details. It sounds like North Korea on steroids.
Yeah, the Chinese wearing the same clothes, all that, the whole experiment. So do you understand? Woke is not new. Woke is pagan. It's pagan Greek. This is Greek paganism that is just resurgent. We are seeing Greek paganism in action. This is not scientific. This is not in any way modern. This is ancient, primitive thinking coming back. You see what this problem here, right? And also communism is Latin, comes from communis, from universal, just like the word Catholic is universal. Communism is religion. I mean, but that's a story that I discuss in my communism series. But just understand, this Congresswomen, right? This is something that goes back. Here we go. You'll see here. This example takes us to Athens in 392 BC. Aristophanes, this is a comedy by Aristophanes called the Ecclesiastes, the Congresswomen. He was making fun. Aristophanes was making fun of the philosophy of the women of the day. Wokeism, feminism, all of this trash, he was making fun of it. And today it is our reality. Do you understand how scary that is?
By the way, just to make a point, in North Korea, for example, not only that you're supposed to wear the same basic clothes, it's even worse. You have like a certain amount of haircuts to choose from. Only those which are allowed by the state. Yep.
Yeah, so hopefully that was interesting and hopefully you learned something. You understand, we're not dealing with modern thinking. This is just paganism. This is Greek paganism. This is the trash that we've inherited today. And this comes from the Enlightenment. This is the science of the Enlightenment that you've just seen. In his quest for virtue, right, Socrates engaged in discussions about virtues like wisdom, justice, courage, piety, and others. And he wants to correct false beliefs. And he says wealth does not bring goodness, but goodness brings wealth. So this is the kind of philosophy that he espoused. And if you can see, it's very biblical, if you want to put it that way. It's very Christian in a sense, right? There's that message. There's that concept of, I would say, natural law. So Socrates sees himself as serving the city of Athens and its citizens by challenging and correcting erroneous thinking patterns. What do people do when you try to correct erroneous thinking patterns? They kill you. So as a man of principle, he lived according to what he believed, right? He didn't want philosophical material possessions. He took no money. He dedicates his life to helping people, to teaching them truth. So, of course, they put him to death. All right. So the belief that physical matter, now materialism, is it a philosophical idea or is it just a bunch of nonsense? So the belief that physical matter is the fundamental substance of the world and that everything, including consciousness, and mental states can be explained in terms of material interactions, right? Obeying physical laws and some randomness, right? This goes back to the pagans of 2600 years ago, right? This idea is being espoused today by atheists. It's become scientific. Humanists push this as the only way to do science. This is the only way to understand the world, this worldview. And we're going to see that this worldview has extremely toxic, corrosive effects. It is not new. It is utterly pagan. This idea is pre-Socratic, and for most of history was a minority view. Today, it is the elite academic view of the world. It is the reigning view in the media, even in government today. Humanists have spread this propaganda to identify materialism with science itself. Okay, I'm going to bring up this document so you guys can see this for yourselves. Crawford, let me just bring up this document. Okay, I'm going to bring up this document. I'll go to page 78 as recommended. So this is a dissertation as well, which goes back to 1935. Right? And this is, I actually have this covered on my channel. I discuss religious humanism because it is a religion, and the founders of humanism explicitly call it a religion. These are not my words. The founders of the movement explicitly call their movement a religion, a religious movement designed to replace Christianity with a scientific religion. So this guy does a thesis in the 60s, I think he writes this. And what these guys do is they explicitly, it's hostile to the Christian religion. But what he shows is that, I don't know if it's this page. So what they did was they started a propaganda campaign that lasted into the late 1980s. I don't know if I have it here, but it's somewhere. I have it. The word science, here we go. The word science, as used in humanist discussions, has many rather loose meanings, okay? And they've tried to blend science into their movement to the extent that they've gone beyond a mere ideological assertion of a belief in science. They've achieved in their argumentation an all-pervasive identification with science, right? So what they're saying is that science is materialist. Science is this philosophy. If you don't have this philosophy, you can't be doing science. Understand that the only correct view of science is theirs. And they went on a very, very well-funded, very well-organized 20-year campaign to create the concept that science and materialism are the same thing. And that was a very explicit ideological maneuver that they made, or propaganda warfare that they engaged in. So materialism and science are not the same thing. Science comes from a word that means knowledge or knowing. So historical materialism is a theory developed by Karl Marx, for example. Plato, as we learned, has a little bit of something to do with socialism. So historical materialism, of course, says that, now they said that there's no purpose. Everything is random. Everything is based on just physical laws, atoms that knock into atoms like billiard balls, and things are just happening kind of random. But then later on, they have to fix that, because if everything's random, then we don't quite see a random universe. Then they've got to try and fix that using various ideas. And these ideas that they come up with to fix the idea of randomness that they claim, which is not visible, they take again literally from these pagans from 2,500 years ago, and they start using those ideas to explain them. The same terms, the same ideas. It's literally copy paste, right? So historical materialism, of course, they claim there is no purpose to nature. Nature is purposeless. Nature is random. Nature is accidental. There is no God. There is no telos to the world. There's no purpose. And of course, then they claim that with Marx's historical materialism, there is an onward and upward purpose to nature. We've got to go from stage to stage, and this is part of our history moves. Because there's no entropy. Things in terms of their worldview, entropy should be the only force, and things decay. But they're seeing an upward progress. So, well, then of course, because bullshit. Understand? It just makes no sense. Any thoughts on that, Harry?
No, I absolutely agree with what you say, and I think that Heraclitus is the first villain that we should pay attention to in regards to what you're describing.
Yeah. So, natural science is a method to acquire knowledge about the natural world, without claiming that it is the only existing reality. And they are denying. Remember, many of these people deny there's an objective external reality. So how can they claim scientific knowledge over an objective reality that they deny? This is incoherent. This is utterly stupid. So there's no reason with respect to the practice of science or the history or the meaning of science that it aligns with a very narrow metaphysical perspective of materialism. In fact, materialism is not even metaphysical. It denies the metaphysical, yet it has to use the metaphysical. So let's look at Gorgias. Materialism has now become deeply ingrained within Western educational institutions, despite their origins in religious institutions. So understand this was so universities come out of religious institutions, and of course they've been supplanted now by this materialist philosophy. So during the 19th and 20th century, materialism has deliberately infiltrated and now dominates academic philosophy. So regardless of the discipline, remember they came in through sociology, that was their way in, sociology, but looking at physics, mathematics, sociology, materialist assumptions underpin these fields and are very hard to challenge today. So for instance, in psychology, materialism literally denies the existence of the very subject that these psychologists claim to be studying, which is the mind and consciousness. Gorgias denies the mind. Gorgias denies consciousness. Materialists, rationalists deny the mind, deny consciousness, yet you have materialist psychologists who deny the thing that they claim to study. This is utterly incoherent. So this contradiction for psychologists should undermine acceptance of materialism. It fails to make logical sense, and it contradicts the area of expertise that these people claim to be experts in. How can you study the mind if you have no mind? How can you study consciousness if your consciousness is an illusion? How can you trust your perceptions if your perceptions are an illusion that are simply the result of mechanical forces that are impacting each other? We'll go through this as we go. The scientific materialist wants to say that only those things that you can touch, taste, feel, measure, and weigh, or can do experiments on, only those things matter, only those exist. The only things that exist are things that are open to our five senses. Yet, we are not available to our sense impressions. We experience ourselves as free agents and as conscious beings directly, and they state that is an illusion. So in other words, you have people who believe that consciousness and reality and the existence of the self, that an individual self is an illusion, right? They're thinking these thoughts, they're convincing themselves that they don't exist, and then they write books and hold arguments and debates trying to convince you that you don't exist. These people are anti-human, anti-life, anti-rational. It is completely an incoherent position. So materialists say that mind, consciousness, your existence as an individual are not real. It's an illusion only. Only sense impressions are real, and when submitted to reason, materialism as a philosophy collapses immediately. It's just utterly incoherent. So if materialism is true, your thoughts, your direct experiences, love, justice, natural law, logical principles, mathematical principles, none of these things are real. None of these things exist. So everything that is of critical importance to civilization for the materialist does not exist. Logic doesn't exist, yet he's using logic to prove to you that you don't exist. Does this make sense, Harry?
I'm learning on your position, and I understand everything you say, but I have many objections, but I don't want to disturb your presentation.
What kind of objections?
No, I don't want to go into that. It will turn into some kind of a long debate, and I don't want to do that. I brought you here because I want to have access to your information, and for my friends to be able to learn from you.
Okay, I'm curious. I'm actually curious what. So now the only things that exist, they say, are material objects at their most basic and rudimentary existence, which is atoms. So this very depressing view of reality that they have, right? They say this is all there is, and there's no reason to think this is true, because reasons themselves are not material objects. They're utilizing reason, they're utilizing logic. They're trying to utilize metaphysical concepts that they deny and reject as illusions, and they're trying to use these as reasons to state that everything they say is true based on the reasons they give you. So this is a completely incoherent worldview. Is this compatible with science? No. Right? So humanists have attempted to merge materialism with science, calling it the only path to scientific understanding. Science is fundamentally opposed to materialism. Right? Natural laws are not material. And therefore science has to transcend the realm of material objects. We need logic, right? We need to think. Thoughts are not material objects. Thoughts simply are not encompassed by this view. So therefore, they already have to step right outside of their domain of materialism to actually do science. So So the concept of acquiring knowledge, where humans possess the ability to learn about the material world and attain genuine understanding, is contrary to materialists. That's contrary to Gorgias's view, right? And I'll be doing a talk next month about Pius X, Pope Pius X, who actually discusses, he came out against modernism, which he called the synthesis of all heresies. And this is something I'll discuss next month, going through these various ideas.
Lloyd, kindly remind me when this Gorgias lived?
I think he's 485 BC, he was born.
Thank you.
So materialist reductionism is like woke deconstruction or Marxist criticism. So you take complex experiences like love or justice, and these become mere survival instincts. And this, of course, devalues these concepts. So love is just an illusion. So therefore it has no meaning. It's simply something you do because, right? Justice is just something you do because it has value to you right now. So therefore it means that it's entirely relativist. There is no honest justice. There is no fairness in the world. And this is where that's how they start to corrode morality. Now, there is a distinction between a genuine explanation of something and dismissing it as insignificant or explaining things away. To explain something is one thing, to explain it away is another, right? So if an explanation does not account for the nature of the thing that is being explained, then the issue is with the explainer rather than the thing that's being explained. So instead of attempting to fit explanations into pre-existing materialist ideologies, from a scientific point of view, you would be open. You would look at uncertainties. You'd be guided by evidence, and you'd explore the nature of reality using a strict methodology, not simply just sticking to an ideology that automatically dismisses critical evidence. So gaslighting, a scientific worldview. So the materialist worldview is that the idea of worldview is immaterial. In fact, worldviews don't exist. That's why you'll have atheists will often say, I don't have a worldview, right? We don't have a worldview. The problem is they have a worldview. They have a view of the world, which determines their behavior, determines their morals, determines their beliefs, determines their actions. They look at actions and consequences and they act upon those. Oddly enough, worldviews are immaterial, so therefore they have to reject them, right? So it has now, they have fundamental beliefs. Now notice that these materialists actually have fundamental beliefs about reality, whereas beliefs are not material objects. They're not matter extending into space. So they hold these ideas about reality and they apply these ideas to their experience, yet beliefs are not material objects. So to them, all thoughts are illusions, so they hold illusions. So they're very committed to their particular illusions. And consistent materialists say the self, as we imagine it, does not exist. If they follow their reasoning consistently and truly, then we do not exist. So you have selves writing books trying to convince other selves that neither of them exist. This is the basic contradictory nature and the dilemma of materialism in a nutshell. So Gorgias said nothing exists. Well, apparently neither do you. Any comment before I go on, Harry?
I should really learn more about this Gorgias. I think he's a freak of nature and very dangerous in the ideas that he presented. Wow.
We'll come back to him again. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, guys, do you have any questions about what Lloyd was sharing until now? "23 people in complete silence."
Thank you.
Sorry?
No questions? Okay, let's continue.
Yeah, so I'll go another few minutes. I'm roughly halfway, so I'll just go and I'll do a couple more slides, and then we'll end here for this one. So let's look at the materialistic method of science, right? So materialists, so first I'm putting down a lot of history, of course, then I'll go into more of the specifics, where this takes us, right? How it affects morals, how it affects philosophy, the impacts it has. But first I want to just put down some pieces on the board before I start tying more of them together. So you've got materialists like Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson. They define science as testing, hypotheses, evidence, and so on, which is all fine and well, okay? And you've got to follow the evidence wherever it may lead. Carl Sagan didn't do that himself, though, at least not in some issues. Now, when you impose materialism on scientific inquiry, you limit the type of evidence you're willing to consider, because by default, an atheist who wants evidence for religion, his worldview automatically denies that such evidence exists. He denies that the evidence that you have is valid. So how can your worldview have a legitimate good faith discussion if you already are denying everything that you're going to be given as evidence. And in fact, you are denying the reality. So you have two absolutely different views of the world, two completely different understandings of the world. And his use of language to describe the world is completely different to yours. He sees the world as not objective, as entirely subjective. These are, and it's crazy how they'll claim there's an objective world, but yet their worldview is subjective. So it implies that evidence suggesting a purpose in the universe, or teleology in the material world, or the existence of a purposeful origin for the universe in the finite past will never be entertained. So they claim there is no purpose in the world, that entropy should be the rule, that yet they see the world actually evolving, improving, right? Things are appearing that are getting better and better. So how do they explain that? Well, I mean, therefore Marx has the idea of historical materialism, where some mysterious force, some unknown force, is going onward and upward, and the old, the superstitious, and the organized religion is being erased, and therefore something higher, communism, is coming, but yet they don't believe that there is such a thing as purpose. So those again are contradictory ideas. Scientists need to be more receptive, okay, that there's evidence that shows us there's a broader cosmic reality, that there's something in the metaphysics. And in fact, to do science, you must use Aristotelian logic. And of course, this logic relies upon metaphysics. And it's crazy. And then these scientists want to deny anything metaphysical, which is just not, it's incoherent, right? So they a priori reject, or in advance reject, data and evidence. And this is not scientific. So scientists exceed the limits of materialism when they evaluate evidence through their experiments, through their thinking process. So they fail to realize that their own reasoning and logical faculties are metaphysical in nature, not strictly material. And the scientific method, which relies on immaterial concepts like logic, mathematics, and reasoning, all transcend the physical world. So when scientists evaluate evidence and they form hypotheses, they're using their mind and mental faculties, not just physical senses. And they're using metaphysical concepts which they deny exist. They're using their mind, which they effectively deny exists. So mathematics, logic, these are all metaphysical constructs, not physical things. Science, and therefore they also then claim that that is a social construct. So they make it a social construct because, remember, they are nominalists as well, which means that they don't believe in universals. They believe in just the essences of the particulars, and that we randomly, arbitrarily put things into groups by whatever method that we use, and therefore these are just social constructs. Therefore they deny the universals. So science relies on metaphysical presuppositions, right? And so the scientific process itself utterly contradicts the principles of materialism. So are thoughts chemicals? So the brain and physical body are connected to the mind, as we know. But the relationship between the self and the soul and the body, that's an answer that these materialists have not been able to give us yet. So the brain and the self, okay, so identifying the brain as the self is misguided. We don't know the brain well enough. We can't answer these questions fully. At least materialists cannot. So the idea that a thought is identical to a chemical reaction or brain pattern does not make sense. You cannot trace thought purely to electrical activity in the brain, because there are certain things that we do in our minds that do not show up as electrical activity. And then you can't simply say that random chemicals sloshing together in your brain leads to everything, or atoms bouncing off your skull leads to any kind of coherent, rational thinking, that billiard balls bouncing around equals thought. Now, thought has a certain essential property, right, that matter doesn't have. Chemical patterns don't have this property because we can think about things. The essential property of thought is we can think about things. We can wrap our minds around a concept. We are able to focus on something and try to analyze it. Matter cannot do this, right? Thought seems to have this element that is absent in matter, and therefore there's something unique about it, a property about it, which is not a property of the material. So to explain a thought in terms of a chemical reaction, both A and B need to have the respective properties, right? The one will arise out of the other, but thoughts and chemicals are not the same things. Chemicals are not able to be about anything. A table cannot be about something. A shoe can't be about something. It can't think about things. Only a mind is able to think about things. Your thoughts? Before I go on, I'll do like one or two more slides. Yeah.
Please continue. This time, unlike all your previous lectures. I was in complete agreement, and I learned so much from everything that you presented in the last 2 years. But this time, everything that you're presenting, I agree with about 60%, and the rest is very confusing to me, and I have to, sit down and think very hardly about those things. So I will come back to you.
I mean, we can chat about that for a minute, because I was sort of going to end here, because this is like halfway point, more or less. So what is confusing? I mean, let's actually chat about that.
It will be hard for me to articulate in English, and especially debate with someone like you. But basically, some of your premises about the mind, okay? The mind and our consciousness is an effect of our existence and the brain. It's not detached from that. You cannot have consciousness unless you have the materialistic brain connected to the breathing and living body. And the properties of the mind are capable of observing and using the senses to observe the reality and make sense of it in order for survival. I don't need the assumption that something else exists outside of reality in order for me to explain what you claim to be a metaphysical understanding of the mind, because the mind is an effect of existence itself. You understand what I say?
So you're saying that there's no such thing as a soul, is that the one of the things that you're saying?
I'm not saying anything. I'm just speaking about what we can all point out to. We all know that we exist. We all know that we exist in a certain place, which is basically supporting our existence. It's limiting us. And the law of natures and all the things that we are speaking about can be extracted from our ability to reason against the physical reality. The problem with people today, and apparently from time immemorial, is that people were able to create abstract ideas which are completely detached from reality itself. And then they were able to create whatever stories they want, an endless amount of stories, which took us to an understanding that served their interest. Usually, their interest to control us in some way or fashion, because we were detached from that which exists. So the Aristotelian laws, for example.
So what is it? So you're talking about religion is then now the controlling force, or something of that nature?
I'm not trying to blame anything right now. I'm just trying to put the emphasis on the Aristotelian.
So what is that which exists?
For example, the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction, which was devised by Aristo, that's enough for me to understand what exists. For example,
Aristotle believed in a divine power.
No, only in the beginning. Only in the beginning, when it was still.
Aristotle believed in the cosmos. So that's actually, the next step is I was going to talk about the cosmos. Aristotle believed in an ordered universe that came from a divine mind. This was the common Greek idea.
No, it's according to what I learned, it's not true. What was the proper order of things? While he was still a student of Plato, and in his early years, he was holding on to the ideas of Plato. Later on, he released all of that, and he basically emphasized his entire metaphysics on that which exists in reality, which we can understand by the senses. And even more than that, the entire Greek civilization and philosophy started from the premise that nature doesn't have an end. There is no distinction between the world and the universe, the cosmos, okay? It's not something that we cannot understand. Philosophy started there because they said that the cosmos is known to our senses, and we can make sense of it. And we are going to try to speak about it. But unfortunately, some of those pre-Socratic philosophers, they basically corrupted reason, and they used that to serve their bias against that which can be found in what Aristotle later on defined as the principles of existence and the logic that can be understood from existence itself. Logic cannot be detached from the physical reality. Logic is the recognition of patterns in existence reality, and so on and on. But again, I cannot do it in English. You should learn Hebrew, and then I will be able to cause you a nosebleed. It's very difficult.
Okay. Yeah, but only a mind can have order. Matter itself does not. So therefore, the idea is that the cosmos is ordered because the mind of God is ordered. Those are some things that we discuss. As I go through this, what about anyone else? Anyone else in the audience? I mean, your thoughts on this so far? What are your thoughts in terms of what I've put forward so far?
I think, Harry, that you do a good job in English, yeah? I understand everything. It's very important what you said.
Yeah, but then, so does that mean that we should not have, that we do not have hierarchies, that we do not have, Harry, that we don't have any kind of structure, that any form of leadership or government is automatically evil, that we're not meant to operate in hierarchies?
Wait, 1 second, someone is trying to speak. Yes, Liran.
It's not that you should not have hierarchy or any kind of leaders. It's just that if you want to have a leader, it has to be a choice. It cannot be something that's enforced on you against your will, because then it's taking your natural right. So if you choose to be led by something or by someone, this is really good and great, and it's your choice. But the moment when you're forcing the leader that you chose on someone else, this is where it becomes a problem, and it's immoral.
I would like to add, hierarchies exist in a natural way and order in the family, for example. Okay, and it would also exist in any kind of organization and society in relation to the division of labor. From the perspective of specializing.
What is the underlying philosophy? I mean, so what is your underlying philosophy? I mean, do you believe that there is a materialist underlying foundation, or do you believe that there's some kind of divine underlying foundation that created the universe and that it guides the universe, and that we are trying to follow within that, with following that sort of divine law?
Gosh, you are cornering me. I'm trying to avoid having this conversation, but I will answer you.
That if you want.
No, let me.
I'm asking Harry, but I mean, so yeah, please go ahead though.
Okay, so I believe that we have a very difficult problem on our hands, and we are trying to articulate a way to organize ourselves as individuals, as part of some kind of society, in a way that is not going to continue to destroy ourselves, like we can see so evidently by the different philosophers, and so many different philosophers from different branches who brought us to, complete destruction. So when we are talking about, for example, morality, we are speaking about setting a standard that is going to be compared to when we are trying to find out what is objective. So first we have to ask what morality is supposed to serve. And I understand your question, I will answer you. I just have to build it slowly. Because morality, the purpose of morality is basically to organize the interactions between different people. And if we are going to devise a philosophy that the end result is going to be the death of people or the rape of people or stealing, then obviously we made some mistake in the way we built the building blocks of that philosophy. So the assumption is that the moral purpose has to do with recognizing something that exists in nature, which is the existence of men and women and their ownership of their own bodies. So when we want to deal with the question of morality, we have to compare it to the standard of ownership of men and women. And if you will test it in so many different ways, any moral question that you are going to ask, when it will oppose the ownership of men and women, you will be able to recognize that you are like, how to say it, like you're crossing the line. You're doing something which is immoral, because it's very easy to clear.
If you don't have an absolute moral standard, what is your moral standard? Because then you simply have utilitarianism.
No, it is an absolute, universal, and absolute moral standard.
What creates the standard? No, but then if it exists as part of creation, then it's as pantheism.
No,
then
I don't add to the equation the question which I am not capable of answering. I don't think if you're not going to have the scriptures, okay, you're not going to be able to say anything about the other dimension in which a divine creator exists. We know almost nothing about him other than the words we have in the scriptures.
This wouldn't be, well, the thing is that I know there's the idea that God is a creator, a being, but technically the correct phrasing would be God is being. So that everything exists as part of his being. Everything is part of his character and nature. So this is not a worldview you can necessarily prove or would be accepted by someone who is not religious in that sense. Right?
Okay, that's exactly my point, Lloyd. One second, Lloyd. So, 1 second, please. So that's exactly the point, because it requires belief and it requires speaking about many things.
Metaphysics requires belief as well.
Yeah, but the physical reality does not
even Aristotle stated that these first principles cannot be proven; they must be accepted. They are implied.
No. He based it on every logical understanding is based on that which exists. He spoke about entities, about particulars, and the particulars have qualities, and they have how do you call it?
He spoke of perfect forms, and these things don't exist in nature. There are higher forms that he believes were part of the cosmos,
Plato.
part of God.
No,
sorry,
that's
Plato. You're right. Sorry, no, but even Aristotle.
1 second, Lloyd, please. It's very hard for me in English because you are a master, so it's hard. But you have to understand, Aristotle changed his mind later on. You can find in his writings, okay, some reference to the fact that he believed in what Plato was speaking about, but later on he completely removed it and he went against the universals and the perfect forms and all the rest of it. And he said that basically we produce the universals only from the existence of particulars that have specific qualities, okay, and characteristics. And then you go and you measure that which exists. And that's why he didn't create, but he articulated the law of identity and the law of non-contradictions, because he spoke about everything that he spoke about in regards to his understanding of metaphysics and epistemological understanding, and eventually even ethics, stems from his understanding of the real world, the physical world. And he was using his own existence and the effect of his mind, that is his consciousness, okay, to be able to be conscious of something. You have to be conscious of something that exists. Otherwise, people like the Gnostic can come and tell you, look, there is a higher realm, there is somewhere else where there is a certain God, and everything stems from that. But then you have a problem. You have to prove the entire thing, and you have to show and demonstrate the connection. So why shouldn't we speak about that which exists? I exist, you exist, right? Nobody will be able to deny it. There are certain conditions that we need to acknowledge and protect in order for you to exist without interruption. And that leads us to your to the understanding that, how to say it, the basic thing here, the basic theme is that you are the owner of your life. And if you judge morality according to that standard, then everything that goes against something that can jeopardize your ownership will be always wrong. And that's what they do to us through all this collective state of mind, either communism, socialism, Marxism, or fascism. They are always destroying the individual who owns his life for the greater good, and all the rest of it. And some people will come with different beliefs, like the Islam or any kind of Gnostic belief or any kind of belief, and they will say, no, you don't belong to yourself. You cannot know objective truth. You cannot know objective morality, because the only way to know everything is originated in a higher realm with a certain God that tells us what is right and wrong.
I mean, so you've got definitely not a theistic view, right? So your view is definitely not theistic. Not that I'm seeing that.
everything that is, because I'm trying to be utilitarian in the sense of saving my life and my family, especially in a place like Israel, which is a shithole, I'm trying to ask a very simple question. What do we know? And we know that we exist, and we know the physical reality. Everything else is something that a free man should exercise in his life without any kind of interruption. So if someone wants to believe in something which is outside of physical reality, that's fine. But if I want to make a logical argument, I cannot.
But then you are leaning definitely materialist, and you're definitely leaning utilitarian.
Yeah, but I'm not materialistic in the sense that eventually I think that Darwinism is the only way. Because I'm using reason, and because I understand ownership, and because I understand the life itself. And, you know, maybe you heard about, for example, Stefan Molyneux. I actually recommend you to read his book. It's called
Stefan Molyneux. Listened to him for years.
Okay, so what is your opinion about his universal preferable behavior as a secular a source of morality?
You're simply stealing from biblical morality and claiming it's a good idea and saying, well, that's a great idea. You're simply stealing, literally stealing from God, taking ideas that have been part of human theological ideas for decades, for millennia rather, and saying, hey, we should be nice to each other. It's like, where did we hear that before? So, because he's brought up, whether he knows it or not, within a Christian mindset, culturally, and he's simply adapting those ideas to his atheist thinking. You know, what's interesting that your ideas are syncretistic, right? Some of the things you're saying are very syncretistic.
Remind me what it means, syncretistic?
A mixture of things. It's a mixture of different philosophies, right? What is interesting is something you said, different phrasing, but the same idea as far as I can determine. Martin Luther says in one of his writings, but it's written in Latin. It wasn't translated into English. It's still in Latin in his text. But he says, in matters of faith, every Christian is his own pope and his own church, and he cannot hold or observe anything that may in any way endanger the sincerity of his faith. And you said something very much like that to me earlier, that you cannot hold to ideas that will threaten your autonomy. Right, that will threaten your belief. That is, I mean, there's an element there of subjectivity. There's an element of this idea that you need to find your own truth. So there's that relativist idea. Yeah.
Again, man has the capacity of thinking and reasoning.
But if you don't have an absolute standard by definition, your thinking is somewhat relative.
But you don't have absolute. But you don't have absolute standard by inventing something that you cannot prove.
How do you know it's invented? How do you know it's not observed?
How can it be observed? You can only see the potential effects of existence and claim that they are connected to a certain creator. But you can say nothing about the creator himself. You never met the creator. You don't understand the mind of the creator, nor anyone else. If someone will come to you and will say that he speaks to the creator,
I mean, so your idea is classically anti-theistic. I mean, this leans obviously towards the atheistic, materialistic view. That's that very much materialistic, atheistic line of argumentation, which again runs contrary to the theistic view, which came before, right? So I mean, this obviously falls into that particular atheistic, materialistic.
I do not define myself
line of argument.
I do not define myself by not believing in, leprechauns or anything. I don't establish my positions according to the disbelief of something which I cannot detect. I'm trying to speak about that which I can detect and prove empirically. Help me with the word.
So realists say the same thing. I mean, realists say the very same thing, and therefore deny anything that doesn't fit within their particular worldview. So I mean,
how can you deny the simple fact that you exist right now? You are, if I'm not mistaken, you are sitting on a chair. Okay, you are supported by the same environment that I share, by the same laws, because it's not like you can build in Poland a bridge upside down, detached from.
But I mean, look, when you take portion of an idea and reject the rest. I mean, that's always been the case. When you look at Gnostics, you look at all of these different philosophies, they all steal from each other, and they all take pieces that make sense to them. And then everyone comes up with his own philosophy. In fact, Gnostics were encouraged to develop their own philosophies, their own ideas that suited their own preferences, right?
But
also based on their own levels of understanding.
Everything in what they say is based on a mystical understanding.
And atheists and scientists claim they're all based on science and reality and reason, and it's like all bullshit from top to bottom.
But what is the essence? What is the essence of what it is that I'm speaking about? I'm speaking about existence itself. Do you exist, Lloyd? Obviously you do. Are you the sole owner of your life? Obviously you are. Is it do you need to add more to the equation, or would it be enough, to just say, I exist and therefore I can present?
But for some reason, over 70% of the world, and far more than that in history, has always come to the conclusion that there's something higher, something beyond just what is the world, right? Everyone has come to the conclusion throughout history.
You're correct.
So
100% of the people.
That itself is evidence. That itself is evidence, and all of them have been looking to define God. And then you've got the Jewish people that eventually find Yahweh, right, through Abraham, and now you've got this.
Lloyd,
yeah.
If I may, the number of people who are actually seeking or believing in something, it doesn't make a true become true. You have 100% of all the people that I know, and probably you know, that are very statist in their nature, and they are supporting very coercive governments to the point where we are, being, if you look on the 20th century alone, you have 260 million who died by their own regimes. Of course, you would say that it was secular regimes and all the rest of it. But people supported by, it's like a multitude of people who are supporting a certain idea. It doesn't make it any true. It just
but this idea has been consistent throughout history. This idea has always.
And so were kingdoms. Okay, kingdoms were from the very beginning. People believed in the authority of other people to rule every aspect of their life. And you have also to understand that you yourself is an atheist to 99% of all the gods that ever existed. You actually used your reason to, and you do it very well, actually perfectly well.
You can look, when you look at, how do we find truth, right? So there's a portion of which there are things that you sense, things that you feel. You apply your reason to it, but you come to this conclusion that there's more. So there's something beyond just the physical. There's something beyond just the material. And then some people have come to reason. Like, for instance...
But you just made a jump. You just made a logical jump.
No, there's some things beyond logic. There's some things that logic doesn't address because logic has its limitations. So then there's that whole aspect of there's something beyond which is spiritual or is mysterious. When you go back to the thinking of someone like Aristotle, and you bring it forward to someone like Aquinas, right, Thomas Aquinas, and then you look at his 5 ways, right? So he speaks of, for instance, the argument from motion, right? And you look at things like everything in the world is in motion. Nothing moves of itself. Right, so therefore there must be a first mover, right? An unmoved mover. This unmoved mover we call God.
But
so he starts making these arguments.
You're doing the, how do you call it? The regress fallacy. I forgot, how do you call this? If you claim that there is a mover to that which we have, a first mover, then you have. Why wouldn't you continue to say that first mover has another first mover?
Because that would be the fallacy of infinite regression. The universe had a beginning, right?
What if it always existed, just like the Greeks said?
Because there's zero evidence for that. It's quite obvious based on our knowledge that there was a beginning.
So just because we don't have enough evidence, we then invent a new entity?
If we had a beginning, then we had a beginner. Understand?
Okay, and even if you had a beginner, how do you know that he has a personal relationship to you, or he guided you, or anything like that? This is called
the argument from efficient causes, right? So if everything has a cause, then nothing can be the cause of itself. So the chain of causes cannot have infinite regression. So there must be a first cause, an uncaused cause. And again, this uncaused cause is God.
Again, let me take it from a different angle. For example, if you look at the complexity of a watch, okay? The watch is complex, but then you are suggesting there has to be a watchmaker. And what is the point that you are trying to emphasize? That if you see complexity, then there has to be something more complex than that, okay? That created that watch. So if you continue that line of logic,
I mean, simple people can make very complex things. So, I mean, we make complex things. We build things that are incredibly complex, infinitely small. I mean, really small architectures. So we can do things that are very different to us. That doesn't mean we have to be infinitely complex to make things that are incredibly complex.
But you're talking, okay, I gave the watch example, but what I'm really talking about is the fine-tuning of the universe. So if there is fine-tuning of the universe and the universe is very complex, then there has to be a complex creator. But then if there is a complex creator, there has to be something even more complex.
No, it's just that. No, that's infinite. That's the Richard Dawkins argument. And I mean, Richard Dawkins isn't that necessarily a very good philosopher. I mean, what you're talking about is the argument for natural order and purposeful arrangement, right? Because the universe is clearly purposeful. It seems designed. So that, again, we go back to the fifth argument that Aquinas presents, which is the argument from design, right? So the designer, again, is God. God created the design based on his character, based on his nature. And we can trace everything back to that character and nature. It's not random. Because if we were following strictly the laws of physics, we would have randomness. We would have chaos. And this is the view that the other Greeks had, the view of chaos, whereas we have cosmos, not chaos. These are two conflicting views, and you stand very much on the side of chaos, but you kind of have one foot in cosmos. You kind of hedge in your bet here.
I'm just trying to explain to you the position about the first mover. Be quiet. I don't know what was the beginning and who created what, and I don't understand.
Yeah, look, it's nearly 11 p.m. Yeah, it's nearly 11 p.m. But look, I mean, your argument is very much leans toward the atheist, materialist, rationalist, nominalist view. I mean, you've got elements of all those arguments. It's like kind of like a little bit of each. It's not.
Just very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, please, because I need to go. It's almost 11 p.m. and I got to work tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem.
Please.
No problem. Very quickly. I used to follow the reductionist perspective in terms of the sciences, and I was pretty much atheistic in many ways. But then I found that the more you tackle, the more complex the whole resolving situations can become. I've worked a lot within the natural world, and the weird thing that happens is that there's this curious thing called divine inspiration, and you have to achieve that in a way, you've got to surrender yourself to the idea that there is a greater mind than us, a greater creative capacity. When that happens, weird things happen. You will suddenly receive particularly kind of odd ideas. And I think this is what's led us towards the theos. So it's the acceptance that something, this great mystery.
Beyond us.
But it is a guiding force.
Yeah, true. No, mystery, unfortunately, that is one of those things. And something beyond our finite knowledge. So, look, I'm going to have to give it a. I mean, so Harry, I was trying to listen and let you explain. I was trying to understand what you were saying.
Yeah, but I was not able to articulate myself good enough. But one thing that I want to say,
it's like you don't have a coherent single worldview. It's like you've got little pieces of many different philosophies.
I don't agree with that. But again, I cannot deal with a debate in English, especially when I'm not prepared.
I wasn't debating you. I mean, I'm just letting you talk, and I'm just giving you my thoughts.
Okay, but just one thing that I want to emphasize, which is very important to me on a personal level. Obviously, even though my position is not coherent, or you define me right now as an atheist, in the end of the day, I really wanted you to come and present everything that you research and to demonstrate it for the group. So I think it's very important that people will be able to understand what you're presenting. So I'm not trying to force my worldview or understanding, obviously. But if you spoke in Hebrew, I would be able to deal with it much easier. It's difficult for me in English.
I don't. So I don't. Yeah, it's like just that. Well, look, in a situation like this, I can maybe give some arguments from one side and arguments from the other, and people would then have to simply make up their minds as to which is which. But you have a definite worldview, right, which is contrary to the worldview that I have. So I have a concept of reality that's very different, and therefore, you're going to find a problem for every solution I provide. You're going to find a contradiction for every answer I give you, right? Because part of the worldview is that, and unfortunately, part of that whole idea is also that you have to undermine and you have to reject these ideas, right, that are entrenched in society, these religious ideas. I mean, this is normal, but again, when you start having to pick and choose kind of ideas, I mean, you were kind of picking ideas from all over the place. At least I was picking up different philosophies and not one particular one. It's like you didn't commit on one particular philosophy.
Because I don't need to commit to something. I have to commit to reason itself in accordance with that which exists and my existence in that space.
What is the ultimate arbiter of that which exists? Is there a particular standard? Is there a moral standard that's an absolute standard? No. I mean, it's a subjective standard.
No, the absolute standard is that when you exist, you own your life and nobody should take it from you. And that will lead you to the understanding of how to limit your behavior in a moral way. The morality begins when you use your reason to acknowledge and recognize the ownership of a man and that you should never interrupt him in any possible way.
According to Darwin, I mean, strictly according to Darwin and according to the people who followed Darwin, reason and morality was whatever served your interests and those of your group. In fact, according to Darwin, it was perfectly fine to wipe out anyone that got in your way and to take in fact, even if they weren't getting in your way, just to kill them, to take the resources.
I'm not a Darwinist.
And that is 100% reasonable. That's a perfectly reasonable position.
No, I don't
reason
think so.
is very
what is the standard of the reason?
It makes logical sense if you want to look at it that way. And that to Darwin was reason. That was atheistic reasoning. This was the morality they derived from their reasoning. So understand, there's no absolute moral standard. So it's a subjective moral standard. That's a purely subjective moral standard, because there's no external standard that you set and that you have to answer to that standard. You define reason, you define what is reality, you define morality. That's the same.
But even the Bible, even the God in the Bible, eventually, okay, one time he would say, "Do not murder." A second later, he will say, "You have to murder in certain circumstances." And there is always
murder. There's a difference between murdering as a definition, murder and kill, right? Yeah. Let me tell you bluntly, if someone tries to harm my family, I will kill them. Okay. Do not doubt that this won't happen.
I agree with you.
Because that will be justified. Murder is completely different. Murder is defined legally and morally as something different. So don't confuse the two.
I'm not confusing. I can give you a list of endless examples from the Bible that are demonstrating the destruction of human life for no real reason, unless, of course, the next argument would be that I do not understand the mind of God. But there is a lot of unnecessary death and destruction in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, which I'm sure you know.
Look, and I've seen a lot of people talk absolute bullshit about the Bible. I mean, I've seen too much of that go around. Remember, I've also seen people just lie and absolutely talk bullshit about the Talmud. Very good sounding bullshit, but bullshit nonetheless, right? So, and I've discussed some of that already here with your audience. So yeah, I mean, there's plenty of ways, but the thing is that then we've got to rely on subjective morality, and yeah, I'm surprised. Yeah.
Again, you are saying that it's subjective, but it's not subjective. It's the ability of a man to make a decision in accordance with reason when he set a standard that exists in reality is not subjective. The part of the base of that is objective. Of course, man has to choose. He has to exercise free will in order for him to recognize morality.
So it's subjective. It's subjective. It's again.
Also, when you choose to believe in a God, a certain God, okay, you have to exercise free will, and then you make a subjective decision to accept the how do you call it? The orders of a certain God that you believe in, and then that becomes your objective morality. but it's all based on subjective decisions that men do. But when the standard is delusional and out of existence into another realm, then you don't really have a standard. You just
That
have
would
invention.
define me as delusional.
No, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about...
Yeah, it would. That would define me as delusional. I mean, if I have those beliefs.
Again, you are claiming that I am not capable of articulating...
No, people are capable of it, making up their minds. But again, the standard is one that... Because the guy next to you is going to have a different idea, and therefore you're going to have that disagreement, right?
But, you know, there is the result that we can observe through the entire history, and both religion and the secular mind produce very, very bad results because they have subjective morality that doesn't recognize the ownership of the individual. Every time there is a new idea that a certain in a god or a king, which leads to the destruction of people. And what is it that they really destruct? It's the question of the ownership itself. Either you belong to God, either you belong to the king. You never belong to yourself, and all those people claim to know what's good for you. So when I speak about ownership,
so I mean, you are ultra-libertarian, then. So you are not ultra-libertarian.
I am a libertarian. Of course, I'm a libertarian. Yes.
No, you would be extreme libertarian.
I'm an anarcho-capitalist, but, you know, using a term
so again, this is like a weird mix of philosophies, understand? So look, it's 11 p.m. here.
Yeah,
it's, you know, I mean, so anyway, guys, I hope it's been a good evening. I hope you've learned something, and we shall see you next time.
It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
And the fascinating debate following that.
Thank you. Bye. Good night, guys.
Bye-bye for now. Good night.
Bye.
Interesting discussion, Harry.